Hello everyone, this is Micah History, and we are going to be talking today about what if the United States lost the Cold War. Now, part 1 has actually already been recorded and created, but you will notice that it is not me who made that video because in fact this is once again another alternate history collaboration with my good friend Julius Caesar. And of course the reason I keep collaborating with him is because our collaborations always end up being so fun. And so yes guys, welcome to once again another collaboration with my great friend. And as you can tell from the title of the video and from my introduction, we will today be talking about what if the United States lost the Cold War. Now, I will say this, and it is very important. Please watch episode 1. Why? Because if you don't watch episode 1, you'll have no idea what I'm talking about here. You won't understand the context, you won't understand the references I'm making, so please go watch episode 1. Have you done that? Alright, great. So now let's get to episode 2. So the year is 1969. After the Santa Barbara oil spill, the environmental movement has begun. Given all the chaos, Richard Nixon is voted in as the candidate who will enforce law and order without the brutality of Lyndon Baines Johnson. However, as he is consolidating power, the United States sees an unprecedented wave of protests and riots, mostly by African and young Americans in university. The LGBT movement first emerges after the Stonewall riots in New York. But the riots are brought under control through the police and concessions are made, allowing students to protest more freely, creating black studies at universities, and ending raids on gay bars. It's also at this time that pornography starts becoming more normalized by people like Andy Warhol, which leads to an attempted assassination by feminists. Robert Guccione founded the Penthouse, which becomes the main porn magazine. And American culture is radically altered. 500,000 youths gather in Woodstock for peace and music at an overcrowded music festival. Because of its success, the ban on cursing on radio was lifted. However, not everyone is a huge fan of all of these changes sweeping the nation. The opposition to all these changes starts growing, and rural and Christian Americans start creating their own culture around country music and the embrace of traditional American values. This is especially after the disastrous Altamont concert in California by the Rolling Stones, which turns into a bloody mess as concert goers start fighting one another. During this year also we see, of course, the moon landing, which is announced to much fanfare by the American government, only for it to be revealed as a hoax, as Soviet satellites get footage of the whole thing being filmed in Area 51. Now this fiasco majorly undermines the credibility and prestige of the United States and causes it to give up on the space race, having decisively lost. The following year, as the Beatles disband and Vietnam War protesters are shot in Ohio, the focus of the youth changes over to environmentalism, and the first Earth Day is celebrated. Betty Friedan organizes the Women's Strike for Equality, while the Black Liberation Army is formed by radical activists. In 1972, American public schools end the ban on girls wearing trousers, and the first sexual manual is allowed in America. It seems that the tide truly is turning. And finally, in 1973, Roe v. Wade passes, but is opposed by President Nixon, which only worsens his perception by women. His rapprochement with the Soviet Union was seen as a betrayal of everything that the United States stood for and a plan to remove the free market. However, Nixon does finally end the Vietnam War at the Paris Peace Accords, in which South Vietnam's independence is secured and the communists leave the country. But just as things seem to be going well for Nixon, of course, the Watergate scandal emerges, and it is portrayed as a coup by journalists, painting grotesque imagery of a United States ruled by the military. In addition, 3 women publicly claim to have been raped by Nixon, showing just how dangerous his views and his actions are. After several investigations and trials by so-called impartial journalists, Nixon is forced to resign from the government. 5 years later, it will be revealed that he's innocent and did nothing wrong in these cases, but this will not help his reputation, as the false rape victims write books on the importance of journalists in imposing figures like Nixon. With this comes the end of the Great Cultural Revolution, and a new cultural ethos has been established, in which journalists are no longer seen as reporters of unbiased information, but rather honest and critical speakers advocating for an ideal future. For that reason, they are free to lie whenever they want, if it advances a more hopeful agenda. So, who succeeds Nixon? Well, it is Gerald Ford. And he does not want to bother angering the activists any further and decides to cave in to all of their demands. With the Vietnam War over, abortion legal and censorship laws removed, only one group remains dissatisfied. African Americans still do not enjoy equal rights, so his first act as president is to enforce desegregation across the United States, and this leads to some opposition, but the tide is quickly turning. George Wallace organizes pro-segregation protests, but Ford, tiring of this nonsense, decides to arrest him without trial. After this, the Civil Rights Act is passed, which gives African Americans equal rights, reparations, and equal opportunity, completely banning any speech criticizing this policy or African Americans in general as a form of hate speech. And so with this, the so-called decade of chaos, or the Great Revolution, has come to an end with a decisive victory for the so-called New Left. The Vietnam War has ended, the patriarchy represented by Nixon has been decisively crushed, women are free to access abortions, men require permission from their wives to drink alcohol, homosexuality has been normalized, and African Americans are now equal citizens protected from any form of criticism. Gerald Ford is praised as the president who brought peace, but this praise came too early. So let's see what's going on outside the United States. So let's go back to 1966. In January, France withdraws from NATO, and this panics the United States, which sees itself as losing control over the alliance and decides to organize an invasion. All the NATO members except the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, Portugal, and West Germany participate, though the latter only avoids it to not invade France for the fourth time. The United Kingdom does not want to involve itself in an imperialist and unjust war, and after having finished its decolonization of Africa, it's no longer interested. Meanwhile, Portugal sees this as a far-off war that does not concern it. The communists and students in Paris, meanwhile, proclaim a second Paris Commune, but they do not get support outside the city, and in August, NATO troops march in to crush the rebels, but it is done in an especially brutal way, which draws condemnation worldwide. But the rebels nevertheless surrender after only 6 days. Skipping forward to 1971, and you have South Korea, which is tired of not being able to trade with China, and therefore it decides that it wants to recognize China in exchange for opening trade. However, it needs to convince the United States to do so, as it is not able or willing to do so alone. Under intense pressure from the South Koreans, the United States finally caves into the pressure, and Nixon visits China, officially recognizing it. This, however, is the final straw for Japan, which was South Korea's largest trading partner up until then, and it believes that the recognition of China will lead to China replacing it as the main power in Asia. Japan breaks its alliance with the United States and makes peace with the Soviet Union concerning Sakhalin and the Kuril Islands. Now, just like Japan, the United Kingdom is also disgusted by the United States, but this time because it is not progressive enough, and believes that the United States cannot hold itself to be the leader of the so-called Progressive West, which is a new term coined by the British Prime Minister. 2 years later, as things settle down in America, it is the opposite in the Middle East, which, given the history of the Middle East, it's not at peace. Who knew? And this time because of the Yom Kippur War, which breaks out between Israel and its neighbors. Now, the United States, as usual, supplies Israel with lots of weapons, but this leads to an oil embargo by the Arab nation. This massively increases the price of oil, and the American economy begins to suffer. However, the oil embargo is not lifted, and soon the United States' enemies realize that they can exploit the situation. In 1975, as China grows closer to the United States, it pressures it to stop recognizing South Vietnam, which annoys South Vietnam, and it breaks its alliance with the US and joins the Japanese faction. Portugal also joins in this faction after the United States failed to crush the Carnation Revolution and encouraged it to decolonize. Now, seeing the tide turning against the United States, the Soviet Union decides to join in on the action, joining the oil embargo, and this act of solidarity brings the Islamic world over to the Soviet side, which is a great geopolitical victory. While the Soviet Union allows Muslims to do the Hajj unrestricted for the first time, the United States is seen in the Islamic world as a degenerate capitalist country, embracing anti-religious and hedonistic values. Now, 4 years later in this area, the Islamic Revolution breaks out in Iran, and this inspires fundamentalists in neighboring Afghanistan who create an even more extreme government led by the Mujahideen. This then inspires a similar change in Pakistan, where They get rid of their pro-American government, break their alliance, and create a more explicitly Islamic government. Now, Iran, Afghanistan, and Pakistan don't get along. I mean, what a shock. But all agree on the need to get Indian Muslims to rebel and to create greater Islamic solidarity. Now, this, of course, worries India, which invades Pakistan to reclaim its rightful territory. They are able to quickly take over the cities, but never manage to subdue the countryside. And Pakistan is being helped by Afghanistan. Now, in all this chaos, it seems like Ford has been an incompetent leader who has not been able to lead the nation well. So, the United States looks for a new leader and finds it in the figure of Ronald Reagan, who as President of the United States is a nationalist rather than a complete capitalist. Although he does want to reduce the government's influence by turning down some of the progressive reforms, he cares more about eliminating the United States' reliance on foreign companies. His vision is not the destruction of the Soviet Union, but a completely isolationist America that will take care of itself and only itself. However, his vision is fraught by failures. A fully self-reliant United States means less of an emphasis on NATO, and this lack of emphasis leads to increased Soviet domination of Europe. Although no European nation became communist, certain European nations adopted more socialist ideals and became more anti-American as time went on. These nations are anti-communist, but criticize Reagan for his backpedaling on reforms and his emphasis on social welfare. He reduces free trade and increases trade wars and is more socialistic economically. He also massively increases debt through the expansion of welfare and military expenditure. This only worsens America's economy. He is able to reduce a lot of wealth inequality for white Americans, but not for blacks. Now, in terms of foreign policy, in the Middle East, Reagan fully supports the war in Pakistan in order to curry favors with India and demonstrate his commitment to fight Islamism. Now, in 1987, India finally decides to annex Pakistan to celebrate 40 years of Indian independence. But despite this symbolic victory, they are not doing well in the war. By 1989, many are unsatisfied with Reagan's reforms, especially his war on drugs, and they are led, and this opposition, I should say, is led by a charismatic drug user known as Bill Clinton. The progressives start gloating about how they will reverse all of Reagan's policies, and during the election, the vote is so close that they recount the ballots. Many think that it's suspicious, and so, on January 6, 1989, many Reagan supporters protest at the Capitol, but they are broken up by riot police. Clinton, who realizes that this war is going nowhere and suffering increasing backlash for his involvement, immediately ends aid to India, which is forced to withdraw without American support and recognize Pakistani independence. However, this actually begins the unraveling of the United States of America. Because you see, this is seen as proof that Clinton is a weak leader who is undermining America's global position. In June, seeing how the progressives are taking over America, Italy withdrew from NATO, followed by Belgium in October, and by Christmas, NATO had virtually collapsed, with only West Germany, Denmark, and Canada remaining. The following year in 1990, the United Kingdom had been united under the leadership of Margaret Thatcher. However, her policies were becoming increasingly unpopular because of her association with Reagan, and in November she was succeeded by a nationalist leader who was tired of democracy. He saw the rising tide of secessionist movements as a fundamental threat and wanted to work for the good of the English people and them alone. He fully ended the United Kingdom's liberal democracy and decides to turn it into a nationalist state. This would begin the collapse of the United Kingdom. In October, NATO ends as Germany is reunified, and this time not under West Germany, but under East Germany. In December, Denmark decides to adopt communism, and this makes many Americans ask why they can't also achieve the dream of communism, as capitalism has clearly failed them. Boston and Philadelphia eventually end up getting independence and establish themselves as communist states. However, it is really in 1991 where the United States starts to unravel. In March, California also declares independence, and on July 4th, NATO is officially dissolved, having effectively become redundant. In August, the New York, Hawaii, New England, Deseret, Texas, and Louisiana all end up gaining independence, and watching their country unravel before them, hardcore Reagan supporters decide to storm the Capitol with the help of tanks. They are opposed by the citizens of Washington, and realizing that they are going nowhere, they have to give up. In October, Aslan, New Africa, and Florida end up getting independence. And Clinton realizes that things are out of control, and on Christmas declares the end of the United States and makes himself the first chairman of the American Federation, a new country that would be communist. Now, with the United States having fallen, the credibility of liberal democracy and capitalism has basically vanished. It was a great experiment, something which had been tried out for almost 250 years, but clearly it had failed. Except for 5 countries: Japan, South Korea, South Vietnam, Taiwan, and Deseret, which are the only 5 capitalist states left. Japan, though, does change politically as well, becoming a one-party state and incorporates some socialist elements into its economy, with South Vietnam also following suit. So why is this? What has caused the complete collapse of the United States, and what has caused the Soviet Union to win the war? Well, there are a variety of factors, but essentially the complete economic stagnation starting in 1973 and continuing for almost 20 years until 1991 with no respite in sight, major wealth inequality, especially between white and black Americans, and the credibility of the American empire has also been undermined with the brutal suppression of the Second Paris Commune in 1966 and the general bumbling diplomacy that was going on throughout the 1970s, whether that was antagonizing Japan or trying to force this invasion of Pakistan, which could never have worked out. So, what will happen next? What happens with now the divided states of America? Well, you are going to have to watch episode 3 to find that out. And episode 3 is created by my good friend Julius Caesar. So go check it out on his channel. Now, if you like this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. And I will see you guys for the next one.